combination of linear measurements and cups. How to measure a puddle. I will use a lot of measuring cups and a ruler. I will use a cup and put them beside the puddle and measure the cups.
So get multiple.
By the way, always encourage your students to draw a picture, right? And a lot of these did draw a picture. Okay.
I may not live to the end of this whole.
So don't you love students? Don't you love to see their thinking and investigate? But you saw some good mathematical thinking. That last one was a little off, using measuring cups and then a ruler. But still, the idea of all, she didn't say ruler. So if you were posing that question to your first grade class, here are some potential standards that might go with that activity. Describe measurable attributes of an object or set of objects using appropriate vocabulary. Directly compare two objects with a measurable attribute in common to see which has more of or less of the attribute. Express the length of an object as a whole number of same size length units. Remember that one was 13, whether you use a ruler or a yardstick or whatever else they said. By layering multiple copies of a shorter object end to end with no gaps or overlaps. Okay, so how do you teach measurement in elementary school? It's a process that goes from simple things to more complex, and we've talked about a few of these things already. Look at comparing things. So if they're in first grade, they're not measuring with this yet, okay? What they're doing is they're saying which one of these is taller, okay? Or put these three things in order from smallest to largest, okay? Then they go into the idea of non-standard units, and this is a really important thing to emphasize. How many nets long do you think the table is? You can have your students estimate. And then they can actually lay down. See, what they're doing there is they're not focusing on that complicated ruler and trying to figure out what the ruler is telling them. What they're doing is they're focusing on the concept of measuring means how many of these things fit into that thing. See?
We used to do that with the tiles on the floor. Like we'd lay something out. How many squares is this object?
Yeah. So that's a really good way to do that. So you're focusing on understanding the concept of how to measure, or look up how many tiles across the ceiling. Since this room doesn't have tiles on the floor, it has tiles on the ceiling, okay? Good. And then they go, still before they get to standard units, I want you to understand the difference between these two terms, tiling and iteration. And how many, estimate, just write a number on your paper, how many sticky notes tall do you think this whiteboard is?
Maybe I better start over here.
Oh, my students can't see. gonna need a taller person than me. Yeah, probably. Which would be everybody in here and everybody over 4th grade.
Probably not me.
I feel like
Not me either.
That's how you know you're in the 5th grade, when you're taller than me. Okay, so, how tall, how many sticky notes tall is it? 15 and some. Did anybody say 15? Okay, so this is an example of tiling. When I have multiple of the same thing stacked up, that's tiling. And by the way, this would be a really good way to start introducing fractions informally to your students. I've got 15 and about half of another one. That's a good way to start talking about fractions. This is iteration. You see how they're like? And you see how they're different? Okay. So tiling is what?
It's multiple of the same thing stacked.
Stacking multiple of the same thing, right? Okay. And iteration is
Using one object to measure.
the length of another
by
object.
moving it, right, over and over again. Okay? Similar but different. Which one do you think you would do first with your class?
Tiling.
I'd probably do tiling first.
I thought we're gonna do with like the volume inside or something rather than like the length.
So after your students understand what it means to measure something, how long or how tall this is, means how many of this unit does it take to make it, then you can transfer to the standard units. And if I were teaching with a ruler, and I think you all do this in 201 or 202.
202, yes.
Yeah, so we're not gonna spend too much time on it, but have your students make their own ruler, okay? Because what gets confusing about a ruler is all those little lines, right? So start with, give your students a piece of paper that's 12 inches long, and by the way, since scrapbooking, you can find any paper places that have 12-inch long pieces of paper. And then find the middle, and then break it up into inches, okay? Instead of looking at that big old ruler with all those lines. And then after students understand how to use a ruler with just inches, and then you can go back in and introduce the 1/2 inch, the 1/4 inch, the 1/8 of an inch, and the 1/16 of an inch. We'll get to that later when we get to fractions, and I know you all already do that in 201, so we won't spend much time on it today, but that's just a strategy that I would use to teach my students. By the way, when they're working on learning this, here are some problems. What's going on here?
Spacing.
Or inconsistent, you're skipping.
Yeah.
Being took first.
Yeah, they're not understanding that when you're tiling, it's one on top of the other without any gaps, okay? And it's not overlapping. So you'll have to talk to your students about what does it mean. It means they're end to end, not with a big old gap in between and not laying on top of each other. Okay.
I know as a student, I used to have difficulty whenever I used a ruler, because I always thought you start out with like the one and not the very end of the ruler.
That's another common misconception. Doesn't that make sense that you would start at one? Why would you start anywhere else, right? Or some rulers start at the very edge of the piece of wood or the piece of plastic. Some rulers like have this much space. So just there are a lot of little things that cause students to go awry on rulers, and these two pieces of paper have some of the misconceptions or the errors that students have measuring, and you're going to look at those. All right. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but why do we measure things the way we do? Well, because of ancient measurements. The problem with ancient measurements is that they were inconsistent. Like in the 14th century, King Edward II said 1 inch equals 3 grains of barley placed lengthwise end to end. What could be problematic about that?
All barley.
Yeah, not every single piece of barley is exactly the same, is it? Or a hand was 5 inches or 5 digits across. That's, well, you can obviously see the difference and the problem with that. A cubit was the distance from the elbow to the fingertips. Okay. Today a cubit is 18 inches. So the yard is the length of a man's belt or girdle. Lots of problems there. I'm just saying. Okay, so here are our customary units of weight, capacity, and time. And I'm guessing that on this little pretest that you all did better with the standard units than the metric, by and large, because that's what you're most familiar with. I put this is in our PowerPoint. I mean, it's in our class, so it's in there, so you can have it forever. All right, would you put that on pause for a minute? I want to